Stand by. You're about to hear the Voices of Montana with your host, David Berg.
Good morning. Over the past 200-plus years, we Americans have been protected by our Constitution. And nearly all parts of that document have been debated and discussed by our courts. But the one part of the Constitution that has yet to be clearly defined, believe it or not, is the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. That is, until now, the U.S. Supreme Court is about to undertake an argument about our belief that we have the right to bear arms, but it's not as simple as that. We're going to discuss in some depth this morning that amendment that we here in Montana hold so dear. And to help us, our newsmaker guest is Lee Bruner, an attorney who is a candidate for Attorney General of Montana. Lee's background and his passionate support of the Second Amendment makes him supremely qualified to help us understand this controversy. During our visit with Lee Bruner, you're invited to join the conversation with your own comments by calling our toll-free number, 1-866-627-5483. I'm David Berg, and I'm inviting you to stay tuned to a special broadcast of the Voices of Montana.
This is the only place to hear the Voices of Montana with David Berg. Call David right now at 1-866-627-5483.
Good morning. It's 10 minutes after 9 o'clock on a, what is today? Thursday, isn't it? Thursday. It's the, is today the last day of February? I don't know. It's tomorrow's the last day of February, isn't it? The 29th. So all your New Year's babies, pay attention. Hey, we've got a really great show for you today, and it's a great show if you believe in the Constitution, if you support the Constitution, if you own a gun, if you know somebody that owns a gun. I don't know anybody in Montana that doesn't own a gun, to tell you the truth. So this is going to be a very, very special show. Lee Bruner, an attorney, is with us this morning, and we're going to be talking about the Second Amendment. What does it really mean? That's what the Supreme Court now is going to decide. Are we talking about a militia? Or are we talking about individual rights? Are those collective individual rights? This is a very, very touchy subject, and it's also one that has more complications in it than Chinese arithmetic. Lee Bruner joins us this morning. Lee, thank you very, very much for stopping by. Let's go back to the beginning on this. It was back in the about the mid or late 1700s, where the framers of the Constitution knew, they must have known it was important because it was only the Second Amendment to our Constitution that we had the right, at least that's what some people believe, to bear arms.
That's correct. Actually, James Madison, very influential for Virginia, refused to sign the Constitution, refused to ratify it until a Bill of Rights was put into it. And the Second Amendment was a big issue there. Patrick Henry was a big advocate of it, and those guys recognized the importance of the right to keep and bear arms. They just fought a Revolutionary War against the King of England, and they had done that with citizen soldiers.
Mm-hmm. And there's some people that say, well, that only applies to a formal militia of some kind. There are others who say, and this is the controversy, that this applies to everybody that lives under the Constitution, every citizen who wants to have a firearm.
That's correct. The actual text of the amendment says it starts with a well-regulated militia, then goes on to say being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And the question that's been with us ever since this issue arose is that when they say militia, does that only apply to an organized militia such as the National Guard, or the counter-argument is when the Constitution means what it meant when it was drafted. Militia means what it meant to the founders. And at that time, there were no National Guards. And the counter-argument, and a very strong argument, I believe, is that the militia consisted of the armed citizenry. And that is the issue that we're going to decide in the D.C. gun ban case, the Heller case.
You know, let's talk about that D.C. case. There was one comment that I wanted to make, though. At that time, you're talking about the language they used at that time. The weapons that they talked about at that time were probably also what they meant. I don't think they meant howitzers, although my belief is that if somebody wants to buy a howitzer, go get one. If you want an AK-47 or a dozen of them, it's okay with me. You don't need it for deer hunting, but if that's what you want to have, you have the right to do it.
Sure. And that argument is often made, that at the time of the Constitution it meant smoothbore muzzle loaders, and so that's the only thing the Constitution protects. But that ignores, we have a constitutional right to free speech. And what you and I are doing right here now, we're sitting in a studio with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment. The founders could never have thought of that.
Well, about $18 actually.
Okay, $18. We bought it down. Yeah, okay. The founders could have never envisioned the press that we have today and the instant communication on the internet. But you know what? The constitutional protection to free speech still applies, even though the mechanism has changed. And that's also true with the right to keep and bear arms. It's the founders could never have imagined automatic rifles. Even semi-automatic rifles, they had muzzle-loading smoothbores, but the same analysis applies, and the Constitution defends the right. It isn't tied to the equipment that existed at the time.
Well, let's talk about then the Heller case.
Sure.
This came out of Washington, D.C. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. Heller is a security guard in Washington, D.C., and he carries a loaded firearm, of course a handgun, on the job defending the officials of D.C. and the people of D.C., whatever he does in his job. But D.C. has what they call the D.C. gun ban is the most stringent in the nation, and he absolutely cannot take that pistol home with him. He's prohibited from having a pistol in his own home, and he's actually prohibited from having a functional long gun, a rifle or a shotgun in his own home. He challenged that case. Heller challenged that D.C. Rule, saying that it violated his constitutional right to keep and bear arms. And actually, the case is fascinating because the Second Circuit in Washington, D.C. Agreed with him and said, you're right, you have an individual right to keep and bear arms, and this action deprives you of that right. It's the very first circuit court that has ever said that. Ever since the Constitution came out, every circuit court that has looked at this case has said, no, this is a collective right. It only applies to militias, including our circuit, the Ninth Circuit out of California. And so the Second Circuit it's the first time that we've looked at this. And for a constitutional lawyer like myself, the idea of having a constitutional case of first impression decided in your lifetime is just fascinating. It just doesn't happen.
Well, it really is. As a matter of fact, what you noted a little while ago when we were talking, that we have been in and out of the Constitution many, many times in several courts to clearly define exactly what the framers meant, and then applying it to our present day, except for the Second Amendment.
Right, and what's really interesting about this case, I believe, is when it went up on appeal, Washington, D.C. and some of the other cities that were going to join in that opinion or in that appeal requested that the Supreme Court decide whether or not they had a right, and I can't quote their exact language, but whether or not they had a right to restrict weapons of extreme lethality, or they tried to really soft pedal the issue on appeal. And the Supreme Court said, no, we're going to decide whether or not individuals have a right to keep and bear arms. So the court had an opportunity to step away from this and decide something that isn't as groundbreaking and just kind of push it to the side, but they decided, no, we're going to take this issue head on. And I, along with a lot of the pro-gun commentators out there, find that very encouraging.
If you'd like to join the conversation with Lee Bruner, a constitutional attorney, and we're talking about the Second Amendment, call us now, 1-866-627-5483. We're going to talk about this Second Amendment. We're going to talk about a little bit about the history of it. We're going to talk about a survey that asked the question, do you believe you have the right to bear arms? So we're asking you the same thing. And that word believe is a very important one, isn't it, Lee?
Absolutely.
Yeah. You may believe one thing or another, but it's going to be the Supreme Court that'll tell you whether your belief is right or not. We're going to take a short break. Our telephone number again, 1-866-627-5483, and we'll be back in just a couple of minutes.